Hello, I'm Howard and welcome to Spiritual Shorts, 5 to 10 minute videos on faith and life from a uniquely Swedenborgian perspective. This episode is a midweek reflection on the subject of temptation or spiritual crises. I have no doubt that the circumstances most of us find ourselves in right now could bring about temptation or spiritual crises, and that experience would include feelings of anxiety and fear. But what I want to look at is the spiritual reality that just because we feel spiritually alone, it does not mean that we are spiritually alone. In fact, quite the opposite is true. That we may feel nothing is happening does not necessarily mean that nothing is happening. I'll give you my favorite example of this. My wife and I have 3 children, now the youngest of which is 15, and it's been a few years since any of our children took their first step. But I remember well when each one of them took their first steps. Every parent remembers when their child took their first steps, when they learned to walk. But taking one's first steps is not when one learned to walk. The learning took place over much of the first year of the child's life. The learning took place when the child first raised themselves up from the ground on their arms. The learning took place when they first got onto all fours. And the learning took place when on all fours the child was rocking back and forth. Each one of these steps is built on the activity or the practice that went before. We remember the first steps, but don't remember so well all of those little steps that came before. That we may feel nothing is happening does not mean nothing is happening. Our experience of temptations or spiritual crises are very similar. How many of us experience that the same anxieties and fears we struggle with seem to repeat themselves over and over again? When we do find ourselves struggling with an issue, one we know that we have struggled with before, do we beat ourselves down for not being able to end this thought pattern or this kind of behavior? This is where the uniquely Swedenborgian aspect of Spiritual Shorts can be very helpful. What I find most useful and practical concerning my new church faith is the insight Swedenborg's writings offer into the mechanics and the interplay between the spiritual world and the natural world we inhabit. Humans are unique in that we exist on 2 planes. First, a natural plane, and second, a spiritual plane. And we do this simultaneously, though we are generally unaware of the latter. On the subject of our connection between the spiritual world, Swedenborg notes the following specifically as it relates to our awareness. This is from the work Secrets of Heaven. It's his largest work. It says, all spirits have contact with the inner heaven and the inmost, although they are unaware of it. Otherwise, those spirits would have no life. Their inner nature is recognized by angels who are awake to deeper dimensions, and the Lord also governs them through these angels. So their inner characteristics become common knowledge in heaven, as their outer ones do in the world of spirits. These inner communications adapt each of them for some useful role, and they are drawn to that role without realizing it. The situation with people on earth is the same. We too communicate through angels with heaven, in complete ignorance of the fact that we do, because otherwise we would have no life. The influence heaven has on our thinking is merely the outermost effect of that interaction. Such contact is the source of all of our life and regulates everything we try to do in life. So we have constant communication with the spiritual world. And evidence of this communication is what we perceive as our thoughts. Though Swedenborg notes, all thoughts come from some source outside of ourselves, and yet we perceive them as our own. So what is happening in spiritual temptation or spiritual crises? Why do we feel so alone and so abandoned? Well, simply put, that's what evil spirits want us to feel. You see, real spiritual temptation is questioning the very existence and love of God. And an evil spirit would love nothing better than you to question God's very existence. As Jesus said, my God, why have you abandoned me?" When we are victorious in temptation, however, which we must be so freely, without compulsion, without external, from God, forms of restraint, we must be victorious freely. And when we are united with the Lord, and our faith in Him is restored. So in temptation, we are actually experiencing greater spiritual freedom, and the Lord is closer. This Swedenborg also explains in Secrets of Heaven. It also was shown that in self-compulsion there is freedom, that is, what is willing and spontaneous, and that this distinguishes self-compulsion from being compelled. It was also shown that without this freedom, or willingness and spontaneity, a person cannot possibly be reformed and receive any heavenly self. Also, that though the contrary seems to be the case, there is more freedom in times of temptation than there are outside of them. Indeed, at such times, freedom increases as assaults are made by evils and falsities, and it is consolidated by the Lord in order that a heavenly self may be given to the person. For that reason also, the Lord is closer in times of temptation. So, the last thing that I will note is this. The Lord allows no one to go into temptation who is not ready for temptation. It would be like our leaders sending soldiers into battle with no training and no weapons. The Lord only permits a person to experience temptations to the extent that person is prepared to experience temptations, and only to the depth that person is prepared. In an odd way, that any of us are experiencing temptations at this time, it is a sign that we are making spiritual progress in our lives. Like I've said before, that we feel nothing is happening certainly does not mean nothing is happening. So, thank you for joining me for another episode of Spiritual Shorts. You know, if you need to talk to somebody, reach out. Make a phone call, send an email, contact somebody on Facebook. Talk. It's always a good thing. God bless you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Spiritual Shorts, 5 to 10 minute videos on faith and life from a uniquely Swedenborgian perspective. And if you did, please press the like button. If you'd like to see future episodes, you can subscribe by clicking the subscribe button.